This is the story of Sophie, a young woman who gave up everything to offer a new chance to 14 orphan children in Africa. Facing unimaginable challenges, she found the strength to change their lives, but the journey wasn't without sacrifices. Stay tuned to African Legacy Tales to see how one decision changed everything. Sophie arrived in Mozambique with a smile full of hope, but the reality that greeted her was darker than she could have imagined. At just 21 years old, she had left her life in Sydney for a month, intending to make a difference at the orphanage where she would work as a volunteer. Her suitcase was packed with school supplies, clothes, and a firm conviction that her time there would help change lives. However, as soon as she set foot in the place, the heavy atmosphere and the air thick with distrust hit her hard. The walls of the orphanage, a dull gray, barely stood upright. The first thing she noticed was the silence. She had expected to hear laughter or the bustle of children playing, but instead, there were only muted murmurs and fearful glances. Sophie followed the director, an older man with an indifferent expression, as he gave her a quick tour of the facilities. As they walked, her eyes caught small details that unsettled her: torn clothing strewn across the floor, children with vacant stares, and staff who barely greeted her. What dark secrets were hidden behind those walls? Keep watching African Legacy Tales to find out. Soon, she discovered that the situation was much worse than it appeared. Not even a week had passed when she began to realize that something was terribly wrong. The children were not receiving the 3 meals a day they had been promised, and many showed clear signs of malnutrition. Their thin bodies and sunken eyes told a story of neglect that Sophie could not ignore. She tried to approach some staff members, but her questions were always evaded with vague answers. Something didn't add up. It was then that she started to observe more closely. She noticed that some of the volunteers and employees showed no interest in the well-being of the children. She saw them leaving the orphanage on luxury motorcycles, dressed in expensive clothes, while the little ones barely had the necessities to survive. Sophie decided to take action. One afternoon, as the sun began to set and the oppressive heat faded, she heard a muffled sob. She followed the sound to a small room at the back of the orphanage. The door, slightly ajar, revealed one of the youngest children curled up in a corner. He was crying silently, his clothes stained and dirty. Sophie approached slowly, not wanting to scare him. "Are you okay?" she whispered, kneeling beside him. The boy, who couldn't have been more than 5 years old, didn't respond. He only lifted his face, revealing bruises on his neck and arms that could not have been caused by a simple fall. Sophie felt a mix of anger and horror welling up inside her. She knew something was wrong, but she hadn't imagined just how deep the abuse ran. And this was just the beginning. That same night, she decided to investigate on her own. As the rest of the staff retired to their rooms, Sophie headed to the director's office. The lock was simple, and with a bit of ingenuity, she managed to get in. What she found in the files took her breath away: falsified reports, money transfers that didn't match the donations received, and letters promising improvements to the facilities that never arrived. The staff was stealing, and the direct victims were those children who had nothing left. As she read, the pieces of the puzzle began to fit together: the expensive clothes, the motorcycles, the indifference. Everything pointed to a network of corruption operating with impunity. Sophie left the office, but her mind could not process all that she had just discovered. She walked through the dark hallways of the orphanage, feeling a pressure in her chest. She knew she couldn't stay silent, but she also understood that confronting this system would put her in danger. However, the memory of that child's sad eyes, the bruises, the pale skin of so many others, pushed her to act. The next day, she decided to speak with one of the volunteers who had been at the orphanage longer. Mark, a man in his 30s, was known to be reserved, but Sophie had seen him with the children. There was a kindness in the way he treated them that made her trust him. "Mark," she called when they were alone, "I need to talk to you." "It's important." Mark looked at her cautiously but nodded. They went to a secluded area of the orphanage, away from curious eyes. Sophie told him what she had discovered, hoping he would be one of the few people she could trust. "I know something is wrong here," Sophie said, her voice trembling. "I see it in the children, I see it in how they live, in their eyes. I found proof that they're stealing the donations. We have to do something." Mark watched her in silence for a few seconds, then sighed. "Sophie, I've been here a long time," he began, "and what you've seen is just the tip of the iceberg. This goes deeper than you can imagine. The authorities are involved. Those who should be protecting these children are the same ones exploiting them." Sophie felt a wave of helplessness wash over her, but she also knew she couldn't just stand by. She was at a crossroads, to act or to flee. She knew she was risking a lot, but she also knew she wouldn't be able to live with herself if she did nothing. Sophie couldn't abandon those children, not even when reality hit her harder than she could have anticipated. 5 years had passed since she arrived in Mozambique, and her life had changed completely. She was no longer the young woman who dreamed of a bright academic future in Sydney. Her mission had turned into something bigger than herself. What had started as a volunteer experience had evolved into a daily struggle for the survival of the little ones who had been forgotten by the system. When the orphanage was finally shut down after numerous complaints, many thought Sophie would return to her former life. However, she couldn't look the other way, knowing that those children would be thrown onto the streets if she didn't do something. The closure of the orphanage brought a new challenge, one bigger than the previous one. 9 of the children, those she had cared for over the years, were left without a place to go. Sophie knew that if she didn't act, their lives would be at the mercy of misery and abuse. It was a rainy night when, after seeing the desperate faces of those little ones, Sophie made the decision that would change the course of her life forever. "Let's go," she said softly, almost as a whisper to herself, yet it was said with a determination she had never felt before. With nothing more than the clothes on their backs and a few personal belongings, she took the children to her small rented house on the outskirts of the city. The modest house, barely big enough for her, became the refuge for those abandoned children. 9 small bodies sharing a space that barely seemed sufficient, but for Sophie, there was no option. There was no turning back. If she didn't care for them, no one would. As the days passed, doubts and criticisms soon arrived. Her friends, those she still kept in Australia, didn't understand her decision. The calls that had once been supportive turned filled with concern and reproach. "Sophie, do you realize what you're doing?" her friend Lisa said during a video call from Sydney. "You can't take care of all those kids by yourself. What are you going to do when the money runs out? What about your life, your plans? This isn't sustainable." Sophie listened in silence, her face weary. She knew Lisa was right in many respects, but there was no room for regret in her heart. Every time one of those children looked at her with gratitude, every time she saw them sleeping peacefully at night, she knew she was making the right decision, even if the cost was high. "I don't know, Lisa," she finally replied with a sigh. "I don't know how I'm going to do it, but what I do know is that I can't leave them. Not after everything they've been through. If I don't do something, no one will." Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Sophie's life became an exhausting routine. She woke up before the sun to prepare breakfast for the kids, then spent the day trying to find ways to keep them fed and clothed. Resources were scarce, there were days when they barely had enough for one meal. But Sophie never let herself be defeated. She looked for temporary jobs, juggled the meager income she received from donations and what little was left of her personal savings. Sometimes she went to bed with an empty stomach, but what worried her most was the uncertain future of those children. The criticisms didn't cease. Some neighbors whispered behind her back, labeling her reckless. Others said she was taking on a responsibility that wasn't hers. In the town stores, more than once, she had been heard arguing with those who questioned her. It's not your job.